Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're hoping that all of you are able to join us and have been able to get in either through your computers and or through the use of your phone for audio. If you have any challenges with that, we'll be talking your way through some of the dynamics of Zoom in just a moment, and hopefully can address any of your questions then. But welcome, we're delighted to have you here. Today's presentation is designed to give you a little bit of background and an overview of NAAEE's Community Engagement Guidelines for Excellence. And many of you, when you received your email confirmation for the website, may have also received the link where you could go on NAAEE's website and download the guidelines, at least in PDF version. You don't need to have those directly in front of you to reference for the course of today's webinar, but at some point you may very much want to wander over to the website and download that newest set of guidelines. And the slide you're seeing now gives you a picture of what that cover would look like. This webinar this afternoon is sponsored jointly by NAAEE and also by the EPA through the EE360 partnership. For those of you who don't know, EE360 is a new cooperative agreement started this year, a 5-year relationship between the EPA and NAAEE to expand capacity for environmental education throughout North America. And we have a number of exciting programs and initiatives going on relative to that, and many partnering organizations and agencies working to make that happen. You can learn more about EE360 if you'd like by visiting the NAAEE website and hitting EE360 in the search box. A variety of interesting articles will come up for that. Here's a bit of an overview of what we'll be doing today. I'm conducting the welcome now, and in just a minute I'll be introducing myself and the other speakers on today's webinar. We want to pause in just a moment to give you a chance to talk through or to have us talk you through the use of Zoom and anything that you may need to know before we get going. We'll then be segueing into a little bit of a section about these guidelines, how they were developed and the process of creating them. And after that, and giving you a chance to ask any questions you may have, we'll be digging more deeply into those guidelines, picking a sample topic or two for you to see how you might use this in your own practice. In the last phase of our webinar today, you'll actually have a chance to meet some of your colleagues online. Through a new technology we'll be trying, we'll be creating a series of breakout rooms, and you'll be going into breakout rooms with a subset of your colleagues and having a chance to share a little bit about the ways that you think you may be able to use the guidelines in your own settings and situations. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that section of the webinar. We'll finish with some closing thoughts based on your conversations, and then we'll let you know about some upcoming events that may be of interest to you. Our presenters for today, I'll introduce myself. My name is Dave Chase. I'm teaching faculty member at Antioch University in New England, and I'm lucky enough to be one of the partners working on the EE360 grant this year. In just a moment, you'll have a chance to meet Boris Simmons, Director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. Bora will be walking you through the history of the guidelines and a bit about their creation, and Bora will be joined by Ann Umali, the NAAEE staffer, who's also one of the project managers for EE360. Michele Archie from the Harbinger Consulting Group is also joining us this afternoon. Michele had a key editing role in the development of these guidelines, and she'll be taking us through the deep dive into one of the specific topics contained in those guidelines. And finally, Kristen Kunkel, the EE specialist at NAAEE, will be walking us through the final series of our presentation, talking about ways to go and opportunities for other resources for you relative to this topic, as well as some upcoming events and opportunities that may be of interest to you. So that's our plan and our flow for the day. Before we jump in, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the use of Zoom to make sure that you're all set relative to that. Many of you I know are veterans of past webinars, and so we'll need no introduction, but if this is your first one, at least for the first part of our webinar today, you'll find it helpful if you mute your microphone. We won't be able to see each other, at least for this piece of the webinar, so there won't be any need to have your video on. You'll find a chat function available to you as well if you wish to introduce comments while we're going along in the presentation. Let's see, Kristen is my go-to for all things webinar-based. Kristen, is there anything else I've missed about Zoom that you'd like to share?
That about covers it for me. We can go over this when we get to it again, but when we do the breakout rooms and you have the opportunity to unmute yourselves, you can either, if you're on a computer, you can click the microphone icon in the black toolbar, or if you're on a telephone, you'll press *6 to mute or unmute yourself. And that's about it.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much. And again, if any of you are experiencing trouble during the webinar, you can put something in the chat box and we'll do our best to try and address that while the program is continuing. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Boris Simmons and invite her to introduce you to the history of these guidelines, how they were created, and the process of doing so. Bora?
Oops. Okay, we are changing. Oops. Ah! Okay, hello there. This is Boris Simmons, and trying to get the slide, the screen share thing working here, and I think I have it up. But I'm really excited to be able to help introduce the community engagement guidelines to you. It is our newest member of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education, and for whatever reason my thing is not moving forward. Why are we not moving forward? There we go. All right. So the Guidelines for Excellence is part of the National Project for Excellence, which is an initiative of NAAEE. So along with these brand new community engagement guidelines, we've published 5 additional sets of guidelines in this series. Each set of the guidelines focuses on a particular aspect of our practice, things like learner expectations for environmental literacy, the development of quality instructional materials, thinking about ourselves, the environmental educator competencies, how to go about the development of non-formal environmental education programs, and finally, key characteristics of quality early childhood environmental education. It's all about promoting excellence in environmental education. When we think about how we go about developing the guidelines and sort of the purposes in a lot of ways for the whole series, is that it's about our collective wisdom. The guidelines were developed through a broad-based critique and consensus process that involved multiple rounds of public input from literally thousands of individuals and organizations. We've found that participants in the process engage in real discussions of the theory and practice of EE, and in that process they reflect on what it means to be an environmental educator, what we're trying to accomplish, and how we're trying to accomplish it. By developing these guidelines, this particular set, but all of the other sets, they're based on this collective wisdom of the field. And we're collecting and documenting our best practices. This is an important step for us of building a strong professional identity and a strong profession. One of the things to remember or know about the development of all of the sets of guidelines is that they're also rooted in research and the literature. Our very first task whenever we develop a set of guidelines is to conduct a broad-based literature review, to learn about what we already know about our field. Another really, really important piece of the development of the guidelines is our advisory groups. And we leaned heavily on the practice and the wisdom of an absolutely wonderful advisory group made up of national leaders. These people represented a variety of different backgrounds and areas of expertise related to working with communities. They were instrumental to the development of the guidelines at each and every stage. So now what we want to do is take just a moment to think about the guidelines themselves and what we were hoping to accomplish, because they really are all about working with communities. These guidelines focus on how environmental educators can work successfully with communities to protect the environment and to promote community well-being, sustainability, and resilience. These guidelines provide a bevy of suggestions for creating more inclusive working environments that support social equity, effective partnerships, and coalition building. They provide suggestions for how to work in collaborative and inclusive partnerships, guidance for supporting community capacity and action towards sustainability and resilience. We've included ideas on how to make long-term investment in community change and guidance on how to reflect on your personal, organizational, and community capacities for engagement. I'm going to turn over the presentation now to Anne so that she can tell you a little bit more about what you'll find inside the guidelines when you take a deeper look. And so I'm going to stop sharing, Anne, and turn that over to you.
Thank you, Bora. And so now let's take a closer look into what the guidelines covers. And if you take a deeper look, you'll see that the heart of the community engagement guidelines is a set of 5 key characteristics. And we're saying that environmental education that successfully engages communities all have these 5 characteristics in common. And they are programs that are community-centered, programs that are based on sound environmental education principles, programs that are collaborative and inclusive, that are oriented towards capacity building and civic action, and lastly, environmental education that takes a long-term investment in change. And so let's break down each of these a bit and explain what we mean by each of these key characteristics. And so looking at the first one, when we say environmental education that successfully engages community is community-centered, what we mean by that is that it is anchored in community aims within the context of community interests, issues, capacities, and it puts the community at the heart of environmental education. It is absolutely critical to get to know and understand the community and connect environmental education interests and capacities with community concerns, assets, and aspirations. And we want to reach beyond usual partners and program delivery modes. Environmental education that successfully engages community is also based on sound EE principles, meaning that EE engages communities in ways that rely on established principles and proven practices of the field. And here we're talking about the need to build on interests, issues, and settings that are familiar to the community and that facilitate broad accessibility and match engagement strategies and tools to the partnership and community. And we're also talking about here co-creating and co-designing programs with our partners. The third key characteristic, collaborative inclusive, here we're saying that environmental education that successfully engages community is a collaborative, inclusive in its relationships, partners, and coalitions. And here we're talking about the need to strategically build coalitions and partnerships and value and incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, and learn from and resolve conflict. Environmental education that successfully engages community is oriented toward capacity building and civic action. So here, EE supports capacity building for ongoing civic engagement and community life, contributing to long-term community well-being, sustainability, and resilience. So here we're talking about the need to integrate EE with complementary community action, education, and social change approaches. We are building community capacity to move towards civic action. And lastly, environmental education that successfully engages community is a long-term investment in change. So we're really thinking about a long-term investment and initiative that requires a commitment to relationship building and an ongoing and evolving process of engagement. And we're basically talking about the need to assess individual and organizational readiness for community engagement, invest in building capacity for engagement, and plan for long-term support and viability. So basically, how do we pack all of that information and more into all of these guidelines? And so I'm going to go over really quickly a quick overview of the structure of the guidelines. And for each of the 5 key characteristics that I've just outlined, you'll find a short descriptive explanation of what that key characteristic is. And additionally, for each of the 5 key characteristics, we've included 3 to 5 guidelines that'll focus on what it takes. Like, what does that look like? What does it take to address that characteristic in our work as environmental educators? And each guideline is accompanied by several indicators. And indicators are clusters of attributes you might look for, and it'll help you gauge whether or not you're addressing the guideline and whether that guideline is actually reflected in your environmental education practices and community partnerships. So it'll walk you through step by step. And now, I'm going through this pretty quickly, but now I'm going to go and pass it back to Bora, who is going to go into more detail about how to get more information about specific key characteristics. So whenever you're ready, Bora, you can.
Okay, I think I'm ready. So what we wanted to do was to tell you, we've told you a little bit about the heart of the guidelines, but one of the things that we did with this particular set of guidelines is that we also added in all sorts of really interesting and fun elements to make them richer and deeper. So one of those elements is that we've included a series of information boxes that provide further guidance about a specific aspect or of a key characteristic or the guidelines or a topic that we've included. We've also included guidelines in practice, which are a whole bunch of short case studies or stories about what practitioners are actually doing. And each story provides some imagery of how the key characteristic plays out in practice. One of the other things that we have included is that we've tried to include or provide references throughout so that you have a place to jump off from, to dig deeper into the guidelines. And finally, we've included a series of what we call supporting resources that provide an overview or background information, sometimes a step-by-step guide to key ideas introduced in the guidelines. We've included 25 supporting resources on everything from community assessment to participatory design to addressing conflict and leading for change. And Michele is going to tell you a whole bunch more about sort of how to use those supporting resources and the references in just a minute. But what we wanted to do was to pause for just a moment, because we gave you a lot of information there. And before we turn it back over to Michele, and see if you had any questions. So for whatever reason, I am not seeing the chat box. So if anybody is putting chat box questions in there, if Anne or Kristen, you could read them to us, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, this is a great moment for a pause. Ah, maybe up in there. And Kristen asked me if the chat box appeared, and yes, it did.
Looks like we haven't gotten any questions quite yet, but
well, we'll give people about 10 more seconds. I'm not seeing that anybody is typing any questions. And you'll have more opportunities to ask your questions as we move along. We just wanted to give you a moment here. Are these to be used in conjunction with previous guidelines published by NAAEE? Heather, thank you so much for that question. Yes, I mean, the whole idea is that this is another in our series of guidelines for excellence. So it's part of the family. We see them as being sort of a different topic, but each topic has been really different, from, you know, how to use instructional materials, or how to design and develop and evaluate instructional materials, to the K-12 learner. So each really bites off another part of our practice. So this, with community engagement, joins that family. Promote listening. Ah, Deb, okay, so that's a good question. So the things of the techniques for promoting listening, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Michele in just a moment. And, you know, if anybody else, Michele, you might have a comment on that. But basically, one of the things that we've tried to do is to sort of say, well, here's the guideline, here are some indicators, and for a lot of the material, certainly not everything, but for a lot of the material, provide that sort of additional guidance, either through the guidelines in practice, through the resources, through the supporting resources, or the did you know. So I'm not absolutely sure that I could say that promoting listening is something that we covered in any detail, but there's probably some bits and pieces of that available. Any other questions? I think if not, I am going to pass it on to Michele. So then, Michele, you should be able to share your screen now. And she'll be able to sort of walk us through how you take kind of a deeper dive.
All right. Am I heard?
You are heard.
And am I seen? It should say
You
drilling down, making the most of the guidelines. I'm heard and seen. I feel good. All right. So my task is small. It's basically to talk to you a little bit about and help you see how you might be able to use all of the various components of these guidelines. And in order to do that, I engineered a thought experiment for myself. And I'm going to take this from the perspective of an organization. It's a state. I'm just going to come right out and say it. So we've been, Bora and I and NAAEE and the Kettering Foundation have been engaged for a couple years now in some collaborative work that is all about using community and deliberative forums as a part of environmental education. So as a part of that effort, we've been working with some of the state NAAEE affiliates, and they've been developing their own materials on water issues, and then going out and holding community forums as a part of this collaboration. And so I was thinking a lot, actually, while the guidelines were being developed, about the environmental education groups that were engaged with us in this work around community forums, in part because going out and doing community work in ways that are unfamiliar challenges environmental educators to both stick with their knitting in a certain way, so stick with what's core to environmental education, what their mission is, how they do their work or how we do our work, I guess, and at the same time do that in a bigger context, in collaboration with other organizations, perhaps getting to components of community change or action on issues that aren't typically a part of environmental educators' work. So how do you do that? How do you approach that when you're an environmental educator? And so I'm thinking in specific about some of these groups, and especially about Melissa Arthur, who works with the Kansas Association for Conservation and Environmental Education. So I'm going to use Melissa as my thought experiment person as we go into one of these guidelines, and we're going to use guideline 4. So just to remind you, here's another schematic of how the guidelines are structured. So we have a key characteristic. In this case, it's guideline number 4. The key characteristic is that it's oriented toward capacity building and civic action. So under that key characteristic, and I'm going to actually view the slideshow version of this so you can't see my whole screen. I should have done that before. So under that key characteristic, as Anne and Bora have talked about, we have guidelines, and then we have indicators, the ways of seeing that guideline in your programming, or the things to look for or to try to accomplish. Then we have other resources. So we have the links to the 20-some supporting resources that Bora mentioned. We had those little informational boxes, the did you know boxes. We have the guidelines in practice, those stories from other places. So I just want to take you through a little bit of a process for how you might use this if you're like me and you don't pick up any book and read it cover to cover. So coming back to Melissa, what Melissa encountered and what in her work in community forums is that even though these forums were held to test the materials that they were developing, the discussion materials that they were developing on water issues in Kansas, that at the end of some of these forums, the participants were really interested in what next? How can we work together? How can we make a difference? What kind of actions can we take together? So although Melissa entered these forums knowing that that might be a possibility, it wasn't really real until the first forum happened where people said, we're fired up, we're ready to go, we want to do something. And Melissa and their partner organization, which is a university-based center that encourages community engagement, they looked at each other and they said, we don't know, this was a test, let us get back to you. So in the process of saying, what is it that an environmental education organization can do when confronted with people who want to do something next? What's appropriate? How do we work with other community partners? Melissa might turn to key characteristic number 4 for some ideas. So how can she work in this specific context to support the energy that's there to build capacity for ongoing civic engagement and to move toward more sustainable and resilient communities. So the first thing she looks at are the guidelines. And if you want to follow along in the guidelines, this is on page 47, is where key characteristic 4 starts. So let's just go to the first guideline, which is integrating environmental education with other communication, education, and social change approaches. And so Melissa looks at this and she said, you know, that's really part of what I'm looking at. You know, there's a part that we can do as environmental educators, but there are also things that other people can do. The first indicator talks about a variety of tools to involve the broader public, and that includes a combination of communication, education, outreach, and social change approaches. So Melissa's is interested in that, but she's really not sure what some of these other tools might be. So from there, there's a resource link on the page to one of the supporting resources that goes into some of these social change strategies that can mesh well with environmental education. And so on page 133, if you're in the guidelines, there's resource 17. You're not supposed to probably be able to read this whole thing, but I just wanted to show you that the resources are by and large really short. This is one of the shorter ones. 2 pages is pretty short for one of these resources, but they go maybe between 2 and 6 or so pages each. And each one of them has more information about something that is of interest. So in this case, I'm going to switch over to the guidelines for just a moment and show you some of the ways that these resources connect within the document and to other resources outside of the document. So in this case, Melissa's looking through and she wants to know more about these other social change strategies. So the first thing that she sees is there's an overview, and it points her back to a framework for environmental education strategies that's within this document. So she hasn't taken that step yet to sort out which EE strategies and methods she's going to use. She can go right to that that resource and kind of back up and start from the beginning. But she's beyond that point right now. And so she just wants to know a little bit more about these other strategies. So social marketing, and there's an overview of that. And then there's a link, a place to get more information. And there's a live link to this particular resource, which is a great resource called Tools of Engagement, which just has a huge amount of information and specific, cheat sheets and processes and so forth. So that goes right to this. It tells you where to go in this this document, and this link takes you right there. Then the resource talks a little bit about strategic communication. It talks about capacity building and provides a link to an example of an organization that works with capacity building. And then there's another section that talks about advocacy, and again gives a link to, in this case, back to that Tools of Engagement resource. That's an external resource, not a part of this toolkit. But we couldn't put everything in this toolkit, and we didn't want to reinvent every wheel that there was. So Melissa looks through all of that and she says, well, that's kind of interesting, but that doesn't really answer my question. Like, I could see maybe using these resources when I have a partnership or when the community's a little bit further down the line, and maybe I could bring some of these different strategies to the table. But for right now, what I'm really interested in is how can I support what's happening in this community? So if we go so she goes to the next guideline, which is about supporting and building community capacity. And so we're on page 48 of the guidelines if we're following along. And so she can read the indicators here, and then if she wants some specific examples, because I don't know if you're like me, sometimes it helps to just see something specific described, and I can then think about how that might apply to my situation. How might I be able to adapt this idea? So one of the guidelines in practice in this section of the guidelines is a story about collaborative science for a better neighborhood. So, you know, you might look at that and get some ideas from it. There's a link to learning more about that particular story and getting other examples of community-based environmental education programs in practice. But that still doesn't really totally answer what she wants. So getting to the third bullet point, the third indicator, use community asset approach to look for the skills, resources, and capacities in a community rather than the deficiencies and needs. And this starts clicking in Melissa's mind. This sounds like maybe a way to work with this community that wants to do something, they're not sure what to do, and maybe this is a way that she as an environmental educator can feel comfortable going back to that community and say, hey, what capacities do you have that you can build on to address this issue? So this again is explained more broadly in resource number 19, which is on page 40. And that gives an overview of asset-based approaches to community change and capacity building. So I'm not going to go back over to the, actually I will. I'm going to go back over to the guidelines for a minute and just show you that, this is a little bit of a different beast. This particular resource has the overview, but goes into a lot more detail. It talks about the 5 kinds of community assets, the principles of asset-based community development. It has a graphic that shows how these different sorts of community capital overlap and reinforce each other, and it has selected references. And so as Melissa's going through this, there's a lot of information and food for thought, but then there are also these specific resources, including this tool for evaluating, for using community capital framework to evaluate specific interventions and projects. And so linking to that resource, Melissa really finds something she can dig into. This resource, I've just copied some of the pages of this resource to show you that it has a specific way of, a specific tool that Melissa can look at and now adapt for this community that she's working with that wants to go from feeling like there's an issue to resolve to knowing what they want to do next. And so Melissa can use this community capitals framework when she goes back to that community and help take them through a process that helps them discover what they want their next steps to be. And then working in partnership with other organizations, including this center, she can figure out where she can kind of, what over time can she continue to bring to the table in her role as an environmental educator, and what can other organizations kind of, where can other organizations and partners pick up the ball? So that's really what I've got. And I think that this might be another time to maybe pause and see if there are any questions at this point. And I'm going to turn my screen back over, I think, to Dave, right?
That's right, whenever you're ready.
All right, there you go. And I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
Okay.
All right.
So let me just check and see, is my slide up on the screen now?
Yes.
Great. Well, guys, it's now your turn. You've had a chance to hear from Bora and Anne, giving you some background and context for the guidelines. You've heard Michele give you a deep dive into how you might actually roll up your sleeves and have at some of the different components. And now it's going to be your turn. And in just a moment, Kristen, I'll turn some things over just to talk about the details. But in essence, guys, we're going to give you the opportunity to join one another in a series of small breakout rooms right here in the webinar for a chance to meet some of the other folks on the call today and to talk a little bit about, okay, admittedly, this may be the first 40 minutes I've encountered these guidelines, but here's how I can imagine using them in my settings, in my situations, with the audiences that I work with. It's just a chance for you all to begin to think about, how might these work for me? Now, to explain that process and how it's going to work, if I can, I'd like to turn it over to Kristen, who will give you the details.
Yes, so as soon as I initiate it, you will see a request on your computer screen to join a breakout room. And you will have the ability to unmute yourself and discuss amongst your group. If you are on a computer, you can simply click the microphone icon in the black toolbar to unmute your mic. If you're on the phone, simply press *6. And we would request that you mute yourself again before returning to the big group. You will see a notification when that time is up, and we will regroup. Dave, we have 85 people on the line. How many per group are we thinking?
Great. Kristen, could we do groups of, say, 5? Would that work?
We can do that. We can do that.
Terrific.
And I'm seeing some questions coming into the chat box. If you don't have a mic on your computer, you can certainly use the chat box, or you can call in on the phone line. I'll put that phone number in the text box if you would like to do it that way. But anyway, whenever you're ready, I can break us into groups.
Terrific. Let's give it a go. And as we said, you'll see a sign on your screen when you'll have about a 1-minute warning, and then we'll bring you back into the main part of the webinar to finish up for today. Thanks, everyone, and we hope you enjoy your conversations.
Hi, we're back.
We're back.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know about Dave, though. Dave.
Dave, we have your screen, but not your voice.
People are slowly coming back to the main room.
Hi, this is Matt Chase.
For us, I think they're pretty cool, but it's always fun experimenting with new technology. And so thank you everyone for bearing with us and for trying something new out. And thanks to all of our wonderful presenters for sharing their expertise and giving us a walkthrough of this new resource. Just to reiterate, if you have any lingering questions for the group, the presenters are willing and happy to answer your questions via the Guidelines for Excellence Special Interest Group on EE Pro. So we hope you'll join for that. All you need to do to join that discussion is log in on NAAEE.org using your NAAEE credentials, and that will take you directly to your EE profile. If you don't have an EE Pro login, you can create one on NAAEE.org, and it's free. Looks like there's a little bit of a lag in my slide advance, but here we go. If you want to learn more, here are a few steps. You can download a copy of the Community Engagement Guidelines for Excellence on EE Pro. We encourage you to head over there and check out that PDF. We'll also be sending a link to that PDF download in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. It sounds like there's some audio issues. It could be a result of people being unmuted on the line. So if you are presently unmuted, I think we probably have a little bit better audio connection. You mute your line. I don't want to tell you to be quiet, but so moving along to learning more. Attend a future webinar. If you're interested in learning more about specific components of the new guidelines and how to use them in your work, please keep an eye out for future webinars. We'll take more on these guidelines specifically throughout the rest of the year, so keep an eye out for that. Another opportunity is to attend the Train the Trainer workshop that will be held at the NAAEE Annual Conference here in San Juan, Puerto Rico, beginning on October 18th. We do have a limited number of scholarships available to help in meeting the costs to attend, so we hope you'll check out the details on NAAEE.org and consider joining us in San Juan. Scholarship applications are due by June 16th, and early bird conference registration ends August 31st. Just as a reminder, we will post a recording of today's webinar on EE Pro and on our YouTube channel for your future reference. We'll also email a link of this recording to anyone who registered for the webinar, whether or not they were able to make it today. You can find today's webinar and all of the archived webinars from our monthly series under the Learning tab on EE Pro, so we encourage you to check out the resources and opportunities provided through this network. Just as a reminder to please mark your calendars for Wednesday, June 14th at 3 o'clock Eastern. We'll be hearing from Dr. Hari Hahn, a political scientist and faculty director at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She'll be discussing how the environmental education movement can make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful through her presentation titled Social Movements in EE, What's the Connection? And just to reiterate, this webinar, as well as Hari's webinar next month, is part of our monthly webinar series. We generally plan to host these webinars on the last Tuesday of every month with some flexibility. We'd love to hear from you about what you would like to learn in the future through our monthly webinar series, so please let us know if you have any ideas for future speakers or topics. And of course, we're always seeking feedback. Oop, not ready to say goodbye yet, not without seeking your feedback. We would love if you would take a couple of minutes to take our follow-up survey. Right now, I will post a link to that survey in the chat box. I will also send a link to the survey in the follow-up email. Again, we try to make these webinars as useful and beneficial to you as they can be. So we'd love to hear from you about what you'd like to hear in future webinars. And with that, we look forward to seeing you at future webinars and hopefully in San Juan. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.